Let me start with Mr. Ohinata here. Give us the basic facts about FDI in 2011 in relation to South Africa and Africa in general.
Well, as you mentioned, the FDI inflow to South Africa recovered sharply to more than almost 6 billion. But what we have to take into account is that FDI varies widely from year to year. So what happens on one specific year is not particularly important. But from the figure 6 billion, what I see is that South Africa is back on track. That is, as I understand it, there was a bit of a concern last year that FDI to South Africa was very low in 2010, but now it's back on 6 billion. So it is more or less back on the trend.
According to your analysis, are you able to tell us why South Africa is back on track?
Well, like I said, I mean, it's not just South Africa, but it happens to many countries, like even large countries like Germany and the UK, that it's somehow it's the nature of things that it varies a lot. If you look back over the years, it used to be almost in 2005, and then it recovered sharply, and then it came down. So it is very sensitive to general economic situation, and so I would say the figure year on year is not particularly important, and you have to bear in mind that FDI is not investment you and I often think of. FDI is about financial transactions in and out of the country. So, given that it is financial transactions, its values can vary a lot.
But is it fair to assume that it follows certainty, policy certainty, political certainty, and economic certainty even? Indeed,
over the mid to long term, it does matter that policy influences the FDI. But on the other hand, what we see is that lots of investment in Africa is driven by natural resources, and such investment tends to be policy is important, but tends to be less affected by policy environment than some other sensitive sectors.
How do we compare with the developed world in terms of attracting FDI? I'm talking here as South Africa, but also as the developing world.
Well, South Africa is a bit exceptional among the developing world. It is the second largest recipient, as you mentioned. How you compare, I mean, I wonder what kind of comparison.
What I'm saying is whether or not investors are looking for the same things that they look for in the developed world when they come to invest in our economy.
If we look at the M&A acquisition of South African companies by foreign companies and investment of a new product capacity last year, there was many investment in the mining sector, but there were also investment in telecommunications and retail sector, and also even the automotive manufacturing. So South Africa is more fortunate than other African countries in that its inward investment is more diversified. But nevertheless, it seems that the mining is still the main sector.
Let me bring it back then to our Trade and Industry Minister, Rob Davies. Are you celebrating this almost $6 billion FDI last year?
Well, I think I don't really comment on the calculation and the amount. I haven't had an opportunity to study the report in detail, but I think that the trend line that there is increasing FDI flow to South Africa and to Africa is actually what I'm picking up. And I think it's very much linked to the change in global economic geography. In that, of course, the headlines are dominated by the crisis in Europe and concerns about the crisis in Europe. But behind that, and very, very many forums that one attends and many interactions that I've been having, and I've been traveling quite a lot to different parts of the world and telling our story. And I think that what's happening is that dynamic companies around the world, dynamic countries that are capital surplus countries, are now beginning to say that they cannot afford not to be involved in Africa. And that within Africa, South Africa has a particular role because South Africa is, as was mentioned, the most industrialized country on the African continent. And I think that we are seeing a growing interest across the board. And I could give all kinds of examples from countries which have not been involved very much in our part of the world, who are now beginning to think about increasing their involvement. So I think that the trend line is something which I could confirm from the work that we've been doing. And of course, we are actively trying to encourage investments which build productive capacity, which contribute to our infrastructure program, which I must say is also attracting a lot of interest around the world as well.
But I guess the big question again is whether or not we're starting to see the results or the impact of this FDI then on the ground.
Well, I think already, for example, in the motor industry, we have seen 15 billion rands of investment since the crisis, and I think that reflects itself in an interest of the manufacturing companies to increase their presence in South Africa. Last week we were at Toyota, where the new quantum manufacturing plant was launched. So I think that there is an interest across the board in deepening involvement. We're trying to pick up on that, and of course we're trying to ensure that results in flows that are going to strengthen our manufacturing capacity and of course grow employment. That's our fundamental objective.
All right, I'll juxtapose that with some of the predictions that have been out there about how our economy is likely, for instance, to do this year. But before I do that, Minister, let me come back to Mr. Khomyeswana here with me in the studio. He travels the continent on a weekly basis. Is there evidence on the ground that people are maybe starting to benefit from this FDI increase?
Certainly. Think about it, Xolani, and it's the point that is it Mr. Ohinata that he makes about not all FDI will translate into jobs, especially if your FDI includes mergers and acquisitions sometimes, where you get one company taking over another company, and instead of increasing jobs in the name of increasing competitiveness, you end up cutting down jobs. You understand what I'm saying? That sometimes I come into your country, buy a company, and I say, this company is uncompetitive. Let me do 1, 2, 3 to cut down the costs so that I can return the value to the shareholders. So it is true that not all FDI will result in job creation. But on the African continent, if you're talking about the property boom, you want to talk to a city like Dar es Salaam, you want to go to Accra or Tokradi or even Juba, where there is nothing effectively. So when you have nothing or you're coming off a low base, sometimes it is very important to emphasize you are going to see evidence. So outside of South Africa, because you can't compare Johannesburg, say, to Nairobi, because Johannesburg would have very far advanced infrastructure, public transport system. If you look at the Gautrain, you can't compare. So if you're outside of South Africa, the evidence is even much more pronounced. But we got to emphasize that a Kinshasa or a Lubumbashi or an Accra or a Lagos, any city in Africa, as long as the economy is growing, will show evidence of that. And of course, it doesn't matter what kind of FDI it is in those circumstances, because somebody's going to be opening an hotel, which means construction will happen. Of course, we want to guard against companies that bring in construction infrastructure investment and bring their own employees to work on the contracts. But mostly, when you are building an hotel in Johannesburg, you will create jobs in Johannesburg. If you are building a road between Johannesburg and Polokwane, there will be people along the way that get employment. And in that way, FDI is always is having to be a welcome sign that the continent is attracting investment. Just look at the numbers. The global inflows in Africa, I think, being 25% up on last year, which means that developing markets even, which have investment up 11%, are not as doing well as Africa is. So Africa is even ahead in terms of some of the rise of FDI inflows compared to the rest of the developing markets. Although some developing markets, of course, are still favored than African economies.
All right, let's go back to Mr. Ohinata again. Mr. Ohinata, I just want to know from you then, given the fact that we're not, I suppose, getting the full benefit, maximum benefit out of this FDI, what is it that as Africans we should do in order to ensure that the majority of the FDI that comes through isn't just to create profits for the shareholders, but also it leaves an impact, a legacy on Africa?
Just before answering your questions, this year we created an index of how much FDI contributes to the economy, and in fact, South Africa, relative to the size of the economy, does not receive as much FDI as it could potentially do compared to other countries. But it is from the given amount of FDI, South Africa has benefited more than most countries in terms of job creation, value added, and even export. But this is just an index, and an index can never be a true reflection of the reality. But there is a prima facie case that South Africa is not doing so badly out of FDI. And just coming back to your question, how the country can benefit from FDI. The important thing is that you need FDI in itself is neither good nor bad. Each country has to decide whether FDI is serving the development objective of the country. So in the case of South Africa, indeed there is lots of FDI mining. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's for the policymakers and the people in the country to decide. Whether, I guess there's a question that whether you could, in some ways, force foreign companies to play a more social role within the economy. Of course, that's possible, but on the other hand, that risks putting off potential foreign investors. So then there's a balance to be struck. It's very difficult for people outside to make a general case about regulation, but on the one hand, investors expect returns. On the other hand, the country should expect certain social and developmental benefits.